In this video, I'll be simplifying the EM unit in CSS, and we'll be seeing some examples where this unit can be very useful and can even make CSS easier to write for you. I have I think 3 examples here, but let's start from the first example. So I have this button that says click me. This is the button here. And this button has a font size of 2 rem, and then I give the button a height of 2 rem. Now this is fine. By the way, if you want to also learn about the rem units, I have a video on that. I'll link it in the video description. But when you make the font size of the button 3 rem, then the height is no longer enough. You now have to do 3 rem for the button for it to match. Or let's say you have the font size to be 1 rem. Well, now the height of the button is too much. You have to change this to 1 rem. In this case, we are repeating ourselves a lot. So how can we ensure that the height of the button always has the same size as the font size? Now, one way you might choose to do this is to use custom properties. So for example, I can have a custom property like this, 1 rem, and then I can use that custom property for the font size and for the heights like this, and this would work. So when I change this to 2 rem, it applies to both. This is one approach, but this is also where we can use the EM units. So I'm going to take away this custom property. The font size here is 2 rem, and for the height, I can say 1 EM. And the EM unit stands for the font size of the current element. So when I say 1 EM, it's going to be 1 multiplied by the current font size. So that means this is going to be 2 rem. And if I have 2 EM, that means it's going to be 4 rem. So now by using 1 EM, we get the same thing. And if you change this font size to 4 rem, the height is going to be 4 rem because we have 1 EM. So like I said, the EM unit represents the font size of the element. But another thing the EM unit can reference is the font size of the parent element. So let's say this button had a parent div element like this. And then let's say we use a font size of 1 EM. Now when you do it like this EM is going to represent the font size of the div. So if we had the div here, and maybe this div had a font size of 4 rem, so by doing font size of 1 EM, it's going to mean 1 multiplied by 4 rem coming from the parent element. So with the EM unit, if you're using the EM unit on height, on width, or on other properties, it would reference the font size of the element. But when you use the EM unit for the font size, then that EM unit is going to reference the font size of the parent element. So let's take this back to 2 rem. Now, one way this can also be useful is you can have something like border radius, and maybe you can have 0.5 EM. And this way, you ensure that the border radius is always half of the font size. Let's say you use a border radius like 5 pixels, for example. Now, this is what 5 pixels looks like. It's fine. But when the font size of this button is 4 rem, you can see that the border radius is not scaling as the font size scales. The border radius stays at 5 pixels. But then when you do something like maybe 0.5 EM, then you ensure that when the font size is big, the border radius scales accordingly, and when the font size is as small as 1 rem, the border radius also scales accordingly. So you can use this EM with other properties. Now this is just one example, but let's look at another example. So here I have this text, a bit of random text that you probably didn't think of before, and for this probably I have this code here. So the font size of the P is 1.3 rem. That's fine. So for the code here, I can say that the font size should be 0.9 EM. So that means this is going to be slightly smaller than the other text. Then I can say that this should have a background color. I'm just going to use this dark here. And this should have a height of 1 EM. So it's going to be as tall as the font size. I want to make this slightly light. So this is going to look something like this. And then I can also have like maybe a padding of 0.2 EM, something like this. And this is going to scale accordingly. So now if I should change this 1.3 rem to 1 rem. This font size of EM is going to get its font size from the P1 rem. This height is going to get its size from here. This padding is going to get its size from here. And you can see everything is small and it still looks nice. And if I should make this even bigger, everything is big. And okay, maybe this is too big. Let's make this 3 rem. If I should make it bigger, everything scales accordingly. The padding is calculated, the height is calculated, and the font size is also calculated from the parent font size. This is much better than if I was going to be using pixels here and using pixels here, or let's say I keep this at 16 pixels and let's say I keep this at 4 pixels. You can see how things look different when the text is big. That means when I change the font size of this P, I also have to come here to change this font size. I have to change all of these things for them to scale together. But by keeping everything as EM, just by changing this, all these other ones are calculated automatically. But let me take this back to 2 rem and now we have this. And let's look at one more example. So here I have this H1, the only database system with high. I have this span and then I have good experience. For the H1, this has a font size where I use the clamp function. I have a minimum of 1 rem and a maximum of 3 rem. If you don't know how the clamp function works, I have a simplified video which I'm going to link in the video description. You can check it out. But you can think of the clamp function as a function that allows you to easily create responsive typography font sizes without any media queries. So with what I have here, you'll see that the text reduces its size automatically and it increases its size until it reaches a maximum. Now, how can I use EM here? Well, let's say I want this middle text to be bigger than the rest of the text. Now I can come to this highlight and say maybe font size 40 pixels or maybe 60 pixels. Now in this case, this text is bigger than the rest, but the problem is that when all the text becomes smaller, this still stays at 40 pixels. And even when all the text becomes bigger, well, let me increase this maximum to 6 rem. Now when all the text becomes bigger, you can see that this still stays at 60 pixels. Now, how can I ensure that this is growing as these other ones are growing? Well, instead of using 60 pixels here, I can do something like 1.2 or 1.5 EM, for example. Now, by using the EM unit on the font size, it means that we're going to be getting 1.5 multiplied by the font size of the parent, which in this case is H1. H1 is the parent of this span with the class of highlights. Now, by doing this, when all the text is bigger, the highlighted text is going to grow accordingly, and when the text is smaller, the highlighted text is going to grow accordingly. This way we ensure that the font size of this text is growing or shrinking as this one grows or shrink, thanks to the EM unit. Of course, there are many other ways you can achieve this with CSS, just like custom properties as we saw at the beginning, but the EM unit makes this even much easier. Like I said, when you use the EM unit on font size, it is going to be evaluating based on the font size of the parent of this element. But when you use the EM unit on other properties like height or border radius, then it's going to be evaluated based on the font size of the current element. So I hope these few examples shows you how the EM units can be very helpful, and like I said earlier, makes CSS easier for you to write. You can also check out my videos on the clamp function and the rem unit, which are currently on the screen. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like, share with others, and subscribe for more CSS videos like this.